I've been a park ranger for 4 years, patrolling the remote stretches of Black Hollow Ravine, West Virginia. I thought I'd seen just about everything. Lost hikers, black bears rummaging through campsites, even a couple of foolhardy teenagers sneaking into restricted areas thinking they were the first ones to ever try. But nothing had ever made me feel truly afraid out here. That changed one cold autumn night. It was just after midnight and I was on my usual patrol. The ravine was a restricted area, too many accidents over the years, too many bodies recovered from the sharp rock formations below. No camping, no fires, no exceptions. Most people obeyed the rules, but every so often I'd have to deal with a stubborn backpacker thinking they knew better. That's what I thought I was dealing with when I first saw the light. At first, I assumed it was a campfire, a soft flickering glow just beyond the ridge, nestled between the trees. But something about it was off. It wasn't the warm orange light of burning wood, nor the harsh white of an LED lantern. It shimmered, moving in a way that didn't quite make sense, like a flame caught in a draft, though there was no wind that night. The forest was dead silent. No crickets, no rustling leaves, not even the distant hoot of an owl, just stillness. That was the first sign something was wrong. I radioed in, letting dispatch know I was investigating a potential illegal camper. Then, keeping my flashlight low, I stepped off the main path, moving carefully over the damp earth and underbrush. As I got closer, I realized something else. The light wasn't stationary. It was moving. Not wildly, not like a flashlight swinging in someone's hand, but drifting, deeper into the woods. I should have turned back. I should have reported it and left it alone. But I didn't. Instead, I followed. The further I walked, the heavier the air felt. Thick, dense, like I was pushing through something unseen. Every step I took was too loud in the unnatural silence. The glow always stayed just far enough ahead, teasing me forward. I told myself I was just making sure no one was setting up a fire in a dangerous area. That was my job, after all. But another part of me felt drawn. It's hard to explain, but there was something about that glow. It was almost hypnotic. Each time I thought I'd lost it, it would flicker again, just a little farther away. I told myself I'd just go a bit further, just until I could confirm it wasn't someone breaking the rules. Then the light stopped moving. It hung there, suspended in the dark, flickering softly. It wasn't attached to anything, no lantern, no flashlight, just light, floating in the air like it had a mind of its own. I felt something then, a shift, like the forest itself had exhaled, and then, in an instant, the light blinked out. The darkness that followed was absolute. My heart slammed against my ribs as I fumbled for my flashlight, flipping it on and swinging the beam wildly. The trees loomed taller than they had a moment ago, their branches tangled like skeletal fingers. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the underbrush. No footprints, no path, just me. And then something creaked. Not the sound of a tree swaying, not the snap of a branch underfoot. This was deliberate, like the hinges of an old door being slowly pushed open. I swung the flashlight toward the sound, and there, hanging from a low branch just feet away from me, was an old rusted lantern. I hadn't seen it before. I would have noticed it. I should have, but there it was, swaying gently as if caught in a breeze that didn't exist. The glass panels were coated in grime, the metal frame rusted and ancient, like it had been hanging there for 100 years. But the worst part? The thing was cold. I don't mean just metal left outside cold. I mean unnatural cold, the kind that seeps into your bones, the kind that doesn't belong. A lump formed in my throat. There was no one else here. No footprints, no sign of a person carrying that lantern. So where the hell had the light come from? I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually my duty as a ranger kicked in. An unattended flame in the middle of the forest was a fire risk, and fire risks were my responsibility. Reluctantly, I reached out and twisted the knob to extinguish the lantern. The second the light went out, the forest breathed again. The stillness shattered. Wind rushed through the trees. The distant hoot of an owl, the crackling of dry leaves, a rustling sound from deep in the woods. Something moving. I felt an overwhelming, primal urge to get the hell out of there. I dropped the lantern, I turned, and I ran. By the time I stumbled back onto the main trail, dawn was breaking over the ridge. My hands were shaking, my pulse was hammering. I turned back, expecting to see that eerie glow flickering one last time in the distance. But there was nothing, just trees, just silence. I didn't report what happened. What was I supposed to say? That I'd chased a light into the woods only to find a lantern that shouldn't exist? That the forest had held its breath, waiting for me to put it out? I kept patrolling that area, but I never saw the light again. At least, not directly. Every once in a while, though, when I'm on night patrol, I'll catch a glimpse, a faint flicker through the trees just for a second, like something is still out there, still waiting. And these days, I don't follow. Not anymore. People like to think the wilderness is just trees, dirt, and wildlife. Nothing more than what you can see. That's what I used to believe too, but after spending years as a firefighter, seeing how quickly life can be snuffed out, I started thinking maybe the land remembers. Maybe some places hold on to what's been lost. Maybe some places don't want to let go. The Morning Fog Trail in Shenandoah National Park is one of those places. It was early, too early for most hikers to be out. The kind of morning where the mist rolls in thick, wrapping around the trees like something alive. I liked it that way. It was peaceful. I'd spent years running into burning buildings, watching the world collapse in smoke and ash. Out here, alone in the quiet, I could breathe. At 47, I wasn't looking for adrenaline anymore. Just stillness. That morning, the fog was heavier than usual, pressing down like a weight. It was the kind of mist that swallowed sound, making everything feel muffled. My boots barely crunched against the damp leaves as I moved up the trail, the path winding through towering oaks and maples, their skeletal branches stretching overhead. I could barely see more than 10 feet ahead, but I knew the route well enough not to worry, or at least I thought I did. I was about half a mile in when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the fog, a shape standing in the middle of the trail, still as stone. Human, or at least shaped like one. My brain took a second to catch up, to register that someone was there. But the longer I looked, the more something felt wrong. They weren't moving, not shifting their weight, not adjusting their stance, just standing there, watching me. "Morning," I called, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. No response. I took a few more steps forward, squinting through the haze. The figure was tall and slim, its head tilted slightly like it was listening. Something about the way it stood, rigid and unnatural, made my skin crawl. I stopped. "You okay?" I asked again. Nothing. The fog shifted, thinning just enough for me to make out more details, or the lack of them. The figure wasn't facing me directly, but was turned just enough that I couldn't see a face. No features, no details, just a shadow in the mist. Then, as if the fog itself swallowed it whole, it was gone. 1 second it was there, the next, nothing. I stood frozen, my breath coming short. It wasn't possible. I'd seen it, it had been there. My rational mind fought for control. Maybe I'd imagined it, maybe the fog was playing tricks on me. I'd spent my life in situations where panic could get you killed. I knew better than to give in to fear, but then I heard the scream. It wasn't distant, it wasn't some far-off echo carried on the wind. It was close, maybe 100 yards back, right along the path I'd just walked. A scream. High-pitched, raw, desperate. I turned, my instincts kicking in. Someone was in trouble. My training, my years of firefighting, everything told me to move. I stepped off the trail, heading toward the sound, calling out, "Hello? Where are you?" Silence. The kind of silence that makes your heart hammer. I strained my ears, listening, waiting for another cry. Nothing. The fog pressed in around me, thick and suffocating. And then, a rustling. Not from behind me, from ahead. I swallowed hard, every muscle in my body tensed. The sound was subtle, like something moving through the underbrush. Slow, deliberate. I took a step forward, then another snap. Closer this time. I swept my flashlight through the trees, the beam cutting through the mist in useless streaks. My pulse was a steady drumbeat in my ears. Then, footsteps. Not my own, circling, moving around me. I turned sharply, my breath catching in my throat. My flashlight caught movement, a glimpse of something shifting behind a tree. "Who's there?" I called, my voice hoarse. No answer. A shadow slipped between the trunks, barely visible through the fog. It was too fast, gone before I could fully register what I'd seen. I took a slow, shaky breath, trying to ground myself. If you need help, say something. Silence. Then, the scream again. Identical to the first, the same pitch, the same tone, like a recording. The hairs on my arms rose. I wasn't dealing with an injured hiker. I wasn't dealing with something human. My body screamed at me to run, but I stayed rooted, my brain still fighting for logic. I had to get back to the main trail, find a landmark, find something familiar. I turned, moving as quickly as I could without breaking into a full sprint. My legs ached, my breath came fast. The fog was thicker now, pressing in, warping the trees into strange, elongated shapes. Then, I saw it again, standing just ahead of me, in the middle of the trail. The figure. Closer now. Unmoving. Waiting. I stopped cold, my body refusing to go any further. This time, I saw its face. Or rather, the lack of one. There were no features. No eyes, no mouth, just smooth, pale skin stretching where a face should be. And still, somehow, I knew it was watching me. A paralyzing cold settled in my chest. It wanted me to come closer. I took a slow step back, then another. It didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe. Then the fog shifted, and it was gone, just like before. I didn't waste another second. I turned and ran. By the time I reached the parking lot, the sun was rising. The fog had begun to clear, revealing a perfectly normal morning. Birds were chirping, the forest looked the same as it always had, but I knew something had been out there, watching, waiting. I haven't gone back to that trail since. Maybe it was just the mist playing tricks. Maybe it was my exhausted mind conjuring nightmares. But deep down, I don't believe that. Because sometimes, when the fog rolls in thick outside my window, I swear, just for a second, I see something standing there, still, waiting. The stories are always the same. Someone sees something they shouldn't. Something that doesn't belong, and they convince themselves it's nothing. A trick of the light, a trick of the fog, their mind playing games. But I've learned that the forest doesn't play tricks. It doesn't make mistakes. It only watches. And sometimes it calls. I never considered myself the type to scare easily. I've spent years in classrooms dealing with teenagers who think they know everything and parents who think they know more. Compared to that, hiking the Smoky Mountains alone seemed like a much-needed break. Just me, my thoughts, and the endless green. No lesson plans, no school bells, no stress. But then I found the trail. It wasn't marked, it wasn't even well-worn, just a narrow break between the trees, half hidden by thick underbrush. I wouldn't have noticed it if I hadn't stopped to adjust my pack. It looked old, as if it had been swallowed up by the forest years ago, only to reappear when someone like me came along. I hesitated. I wasn't an experienced hiker, but I wasn't careless either. The main trail was safe, mapped, and predictable. This was something else. But the forest was quiet, too quiet, and something about that silence felt expectant. I told myself it was just a detour, a shortcut. Maybe it led to a hidden viewpoint, some scenic overlook no one else knew about. The idea of finding something undiscovered excited me. I stepped off the main path. That was my first mistake. The deeper I went, the narrower the trail became. At first, it was just the occasional overgrown branch or tangled root. But after a few minutes, the path itself seemed to be shrinking, pressing in on me. The canopy overhead thickened, blotting out the sky. The light turned dim and green, filtered through layers of tangled leaves, and then I heard the footsteps. At first, I thought they were my own, the crunch of leaves, the soft rustle of disturbed brush, but when I stopped, they didn't. I turned sharply, scanning the trees. Nothing but thick, unmoving shadows. My pulse quickened. Probably an animal, I told myself. A deer, a squirrel, something small, something harmless. But the sound had been too steady, too deliberate, like someone walking, keeping pace with me just out of sight. I swallowed hard and kept moving. Minutes passed. Or maybe an hour, I wasn't sure anymore. The path was barely a trail now, just a gap between twisted trunks, forcing me to duck, sidestep, squeeze through tight spaces. My gut told me to turn back, but somehow I couldn't. It was like the forest had changed behind me, like if I turned around, I wouldn't find my way back. And then I heard it. A whisper. Soft. Almost melodic. A woman's voice, somewhere up ahead, murmuring words I couldn't quite understand. I stopped dead. My breath hitched. Hello? My voice sounded wrong in the thick air, swallowed up too quickly. The whispering stopped. Silence. I should have turned around right then and there. I should have run, should have fought through whatever tangled mess the forest threw in my way. But I didn't, because after the whispering stopped, something worse took its place. The breathing, shallow, ragged, just behind me. I spun, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. No one, nothing, just trees, just shadows. And then, the footsteps again. This time, they weren't pacing me, they were coming closer. I ran. The path twisted wildly, no longer a path at all. I pushed forward blindly, branches clawing at my arms, thorns tearing at my skin, something whispering just out of reach, too faint to make sense of. The ground felt wrong beneath my feet, soft, shifting, like I was walking on something that wasn't supposed to be walked on. I stumbled into a clearing so suddenly that I nearly fell forward. For a moment, I felt relief. Open space, a break from the choking density of the trees. But then I saw what stood in the center of the clearing. A tree. Only it wasn't like the others. It was tall, blackened, hollowed out, like it had been struck by lightning and left to rot. Its bark was split open in places, revealing something dark and pulsing beneath. The roots curled outward like grasping fingers, half buried in the damp soil, and from the center of the hollow trunk I saw it. A face. Pale, human-shaped but wrong, stretched, twisted, eyes too large, mouth slightly open, as if in the middle of a breath, and it was watching me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The whispering started again, all around me now, overlapping voices, too many to count. The thing in the tree smiled. I don't remember running. I don't remember finding the trail again. One moment I was staring into that hollow, into that face, and the next I was back on the main path, gasping for air, my body covered in dirt and scratches. The sun had moved, hours had passed, but somehow I was back. I turned, expecting to see the break in the trees where I had wandered off, expecting to see the forgotten path I had taken. But there was nothing. No break, no gap, just an unbroken wall of trees, dense and impassable. Like the path had never been there at all. I don't know what I saw that day. I don't know how I got out. I told myself it was exhaustion, dehydration, some kind of hallucination, but every time I think about that tree, about the thing inside it, I feel that same cold weight settle in my chest. Like something is waiting, like something let me go. And the worst part? Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, staring at the ceiling, I still hear it. The whispering. I used to think the forest was a place of peace, a refuge from the chaos of everyday life. But after what I've seen, I know better. The wilderness isn't empty. It watches, it waits, and sometimes it follows you home. After hearing about Ethan's experience on the fog-covered trail and Lily's encounter with that thing in the hollowed-out tree, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong with these woods. These weren't just stories, these were warnings. But still, I told myself those were their experiences, not mine. I had no reason to be afraid. Then, I met him. It started on a crisp autumn afternoon, the kind where the air is sharp, but the sun still cuts through the trees in golden streaks. I had a few days off from my shifts at the hospital, and I wanted nothing more than some solitude. Some time to breathe. That's why I'd chosen Moss Creek Trail, a quiet, lesser-known route in Maine that wound through towering pines and led to a secluded overlook. It was perfect, until it wasn't. The first time I saw him, I was about 3 miles in. At first, he was just a pale figure standing far off the trail, barely visible through the trees. I wouldn't have noticed him if not for the way the sunlight hit, casting long, thin shadows across his motionless form. I stopped, squinted. He was too still. I've spent years working in emergency rooms, seeing people in all states of distress, panic, pain, fear. This man showed none of that. He stood like a mannequin, head slightly tilted as if listening. "Hey, you all right?" I called out, no response. Something about the way he stood made my stomach twist. He was just close enough that I should have seen his face clearly, but the shadows were wrong, making his features look blurred. I took a slow step forward. "Sir?" And then he was gone. Not in the way someone turns and walks away, not in the way someone ducks behind a tree. Gone, as if the space he'd occupied had never been filled. The hairs on the back of my neck rose. I told myself I was imagining things, that the light, the trees, the long shifts at the hospital had messed with my head, but my gut told me something else. I should have turned back. I didn't. I hiked another mile, trying to shake the unease settling into my bones. The forest felt different now, quieter, the way it gets right before a storm. The wind had died, even the birds had stopped chirping, and then I saw him again. Closer this time, standing just off the trail, maybe 20 feet away, unmoving. My breath hitched. I could see him more clearly now. Tall, thin, skin almost colorless, like he had never seen the sun. His clothes were simple, dark pants, a loose button-up, but they looked off, like they belonged to another era. He didn't blink, didn't breathe. He just watched me. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to keep walking, to pretend I hadn't seen him, to ignore the way his head tilted slightly as I passed. So I did. I picked up my pace, pushing forward, not daring to look back. My body felt tight, every nerve on high alert. I told myself it was fine, that there was a perfectly reasonable explanation for all of this. But then, I reached a bend in the trail, and there he was, standing in the middle of the path. I skidded to a stop, my pulse slamming against my ribs. No way. There was no way he could have gotten ahead of me. I hadn't heard anything. No footsteps, no rustling leaves, nothing. I took a step back. He didn't move. Didn't speak. His face was still wrong, like the shadows refused to let me see him clearly. I took another step back, and another. My body screamed for me to turn and run, but something in me knew if I ran, he would chase me, so I walked. Slow, controlled, never looking away. I moved past him, heart hammering, my breath coming too fast. I forced myself to keep walking, to count my steps. 1, 2, 3. Then, from just behind me, I heard it. Footsteps. He was following me. I couldn't help it. I turned, and he was closer. I stumbled back, my foot catching on a root, barely managing to stay upright. He was only a few feet away now, staring down at me with that same unnatural stillness. His face was clearer now, but the details didn't make sense. His features were stretched, his mouth slightly open like he was trying to remember how to speak. I took another step back. "Please." He moved. Not a normal step, not the way a person walks. It was like he glided, like the space between us had simply disappeared. I turned and ran. Branches tore at my arms, my lungs burned, but I didn't stop. I could hear him, footsteps matching mine, too fast, too light. The parking lot wasn't far. If I could just reach it, if I could just get to my car. I burst from the tree line, my car in sight. I didn't dare look back. I fumbled for my keys, hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped them. I yanked the door open, throwing myself inside and slamming the lock down. Only then did I look up, and there he was, standing just at the edge of the forest, watching. He didn't move, didn't follow, just stood there as if he was waiting, as if he knew I'd be back. I don't remember the drive home. My hands were white-knuckled on the wheel, my brain refusing to process what had happened. But when I finally reached my apartment, when I stepped inside and locked the door behind me, I made the mistake of looking in the hallway mirror, and for just a split second I saw him standing behind me, watching, waiting. By now, I don't try to explain what happens in the deep woods. I don't try to rationalize what Ethan saw in the mist. or what Lily heard whispering from that tree. And I sure as hell don't question whatever followed Natalie back to her car. Some places just aren't meant to be understood. That's why, when I heard about Echo Ridge Trail, I should have known better. I'm a photographer, not the cityscape kind, not the wedding kind, the kind that goes out into the wilderness for weeks at a time, hunting for those rare, untouched landscapes that make you feel like you've stepped into another world. That's what drew me to North Carolina in the first place: rolling fog, towering pines, waterfalls cutting through jagged rock. I'd heard about Echo Ridge from a few old hikers, always in the same hushed tone. They said it was beautiful, but it had a way of getting under your skin. That only made me more curious. So I packed my gear, checked into a tiny one-room cabin near the base of the trail, and set out just after sunrise. The first few miles were everything I'd hoped for. Dense forest, golden morning light streaming through the canopy, mists still clinging to the valleys. I was in my element, stopping every few minutes to capture the sheer stillness of it all. But then I reached a clearing, and I saw him. A figure stood just at the edge of the tree line, barely visible through the shifting light. Tall, thin, face obscured by something dark and tattered. I adjusted my lens, thinking I'd stumbled on another hiker, but the more I focused, the stranger it got. His veil, if that's what it was, looked old, dragged like it had been dragged through the dirt. It swayed slightly, even though the air was still. I raised my camera, adjusting the focus. Click. When I checked the screen, the clearing was empty. I frowned, looked up. He was still there. Click. Again, nothing. My stomach turned. I'd been shooting long enough to know how light played tricks, but this wasn't light. This was something else. Then he moved. Not toward me, not away, just sideways, slipping deeper into the trees. I should have walked away. I should have turned back. Instead, I followed. The deeper I went, the quieter the world became. The birds had stopped. The wind had stilled. All I could hear was the rhythmic crunch of my own footsteps. And then, up ahead, a flash of dark fabric between the trees. He was waiting. Click. Nothing. Click. Still nothing. A shiver crawled down my spine. I took another step forward. A branch snapped behind me. I whipped around, my pulse hammering. No one there. But when I turned back, he was closer, standing just a few yards away now, still shrouded in that blackened veil. I couldn't see his face, but I felt him watching me. My breath came too fast, too loud in the dead silence. I took a slow step back. Hesitance, he didn't move. I turned, and then I ran. I didn't stop until I hit the main trail, my lungs burning. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see him right behind me, but the forest was empty, just trees, just shadows. I forced myself to keep going, pushing the fear down. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe the exhaustion, the long hours behind the camera had finally gotten to me. Back at the cabin, I set my gear down, poured a drink, and tried to shake the lingering unease. And then I made the mistake of checking my photos. I flicked through shot after shot of empty forest, every frame lacking what I knew I had seen, until the last one. I stopped breathing. There, in the final image, a faint, distorted shape. Not standing behind me. So close I should have felt his breath on my neck. I left at dawn, didn't pack my gear, didn't tell the owners of the cabin. I just grabbed my keys and drove. I don't know what I saw out there. I don't want to know. But if you ever find yourself on Echo Ridge Trail and you see something watching from the trees, don't take a picture, and whatever you do, don't follow. By now, I know better than to dismiss the stories. Jack's lantern, Ethan's fog, Lily's whispers, Natalie's stranger, Marcus's veiled man. I've heard them all, and they all say the same thing. The forest is watching. Some places in the wilderness aren't just quiet. They aren't just isolated. They are wrong. Deepwood Hollow, Georgia. It's not on the official maps. Most hikers avoid it. The locals don't talk about it. But that didn't stop Derek Carter from planning a weekend backpacking trip with his friends. It should have. Derek had always been the adventurous type, The kind of guy who ignored warnings, pushed boundaries, so when an old-timer at the last gas station told him, "Best keep to the main trails," he just laughed it off. "Come on, man, it's just the woods," he'd said, shouldering his pack. He had no idea how wrong he was. They set up camp deep in the forest, miles from the nearest road, no cell service, no way out except on foot. It was exactly what they wanted, true isolation. The first sign something was off came after sunset. Derek was half asleep in his tent when he heard it. Whispering, soft, low, just beyond the fabric of the tent. At first he thought it was just his friends, Ben and Chris, talking outside, but as he listened closer, his stomach tightened. The voices weren't theirs. They were too many, too layered. A dozen hushed tones, speaking words he couldn't quite make out. He sat up, his pulse thrumming against his ribs. "Ben?" he whispered. "Chris?" No response. Carefully, he unzipped the tent. The fire was still burning low, casting flickering shadows across the clearing. His friends were asleep, zipped up in their own tents. And just beyond the firelight, they stood there. Tall, thin, motionless, figures 6, maybe 7 of them, just at the tree line. Their bodies were gaunt, skin stretched too tight over sharp bones. Their faces were hollow, deep black pits where eyes should have been. They didn't move, didn't breathe, just watched. Derek's body locked up. His brain screamed at him to run, but he couldn't. He could only stare back. The fire crackled. A log shifted. The embers glowed red, casting brief flashes of light. For a split second, he saw their mouths, wide, open, grinning. Then the fire flickered, and they were gone. Derek scrambled backward into his tent, yanking the zipper up so fast it jammed. His breath came in short, sharp bursts, his pulse hammering. He pressed his ear to the thin fabric, listening. Silence. Then, footsteps, circling, slow, methodical. They were still there. He forced himself to breathe, to think. He needed to wake the others. Shaking, he reached out and unzipped Chris's tent. Chris wasn't inside. Neither was Ben. The sleeping bags were untouched, their packs still there. But his friends were gone. Panic clawed at his throat. He grabbed his flashlight, clicked it on and swung it toward the trees. Nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign that anyone had been there at all. And then, the whispering started again. Closer this time, coming from all around him. Derek spun in a slow circle, the flashlight beam trembling in his grip. The trees loomed too tall, the night too dark, the air too still. A shape shifted at the edge of the light. He swung toward it, but it was gone. Another shape. Another. Each time he turned, they moved closer. Then, the voices stopped. Everything went silent. Derek stood frozen, his breath catching in his throat. And then, he felt it. A presence behind him. Something tall, waiting. Slowly, painfully, he turned. And there, inches from his face, was one of them. Empty, gaping eyes. Mouth stretched into something too wide, too hungry. Derek sucked in a sharp breath, and the world blinked out. He woke up at sunrise, flat on his back, alone. No tents, no fire, no Ben, no Chris, just trees, just silence, just his own footprints leading out of the forest. His friends' tracks? Gone. Their gear? Gone. Like they'd never been there at all. Derek never told anyone what happened, but some nights, when the air is too still, when the shadows stretch too long, he swears he still hears them, whispering, calling his name, and he knows, deep down, they never left. And one day, they'll come back for him. If there's one thing these stories have taught me, it's that the wilderness is not as empty as we like to believe. The forests, the mountains, the deep and uncharted places of the world, they hold secrets. Some are ancient, some are hungry, and some are simply waiting. I don't tell these stories to scare you, not just for that. I tell them because they're warnings. Jack's lantern, Ethan's fog, Lily's whispers, Natalie's pale stranger, Marcus's veiled man, and Derek's hollow ones. Each of them made the same mistake. They ignored the signs. They stepped off the path. They followed something they shouldn't have followed. And the forest? It doesn't always let you go. So if you take anything from these stories, let it be this: stay on the marked trails. Those barriers, those warnings, those paths carved by rangers, they exist for a reason. They separate what's known from what shouldn't be disturbed. Trust your instincts. If the air suddenly turns still, if the birds stop singing, if something just feels wrong, leave. Do not question it. Do not try to explain it away. Never follow something that wants to be followed. Lights that shouldn't be there, figures that disappear and reappear closer, footsteps when you're alone. These are not people, these are not things you can reason with. They are lures, and if you go too far, you may never come back. Do not return. If something follows you out of the woods, if you feel it lingering at the edge of your vision, at the corner of your mirror, ignore it, do not acknowledge it, do not go back thinking you can find answers, because the truth is, some questions aren't meant to be answered. There are places in this world where the rules do not apply, where the forest watches, where the mist moves on its own, where something wears the shape of a man but is not a man at all. These stories, they are not fiction, they are reminders. So if you ever find yourself hiking a lonely trail, if you see a glimmer of light where there should be none, if the air turns heavy and silent, turn around, because some trails don't lead you back. I want to take a moment to thank each and every one of you for listening, for diving into these stories with me, your support, your comments, your own chilling experiences that you share. It means more than you know. Enigma of the Unknown wouldn't be what it is without you. If you've enjoyed these stories, let me know. And if you have your own encounters with the unknown, drop them in the comments. I'd love to hear them. Remember to stay safe, stay aware, and most importantly, stay on the path. Until next time, I'll see you in the next nightmare.